Hello, BookTube. It's the first Sunday in September, and Sundays are the day on this channel when we do our read-alongs. For the first two Sundays in September, we will be doing a read-along of Arthur Conan Doyle's 1887 novel, A Study in Scarlet, the novel that introduces Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to the reading world. This is the beautiful Penguin Classic Deluxe edition of the four novels of Sherlock Holmes, with a cover by Adam Simpson that is just beautiful. Wraps all the way around to give you the whole of the Victorian world of Sherlock Holmes. This week we'll be doing the first half. Conveniently enough, A Study in Scarlet is split into two equal halves and equal in length of page count, I should say. They're not equal in any other way, as I'm afraid you're going to learn, those of you who are reading A Study in Scarlet for the first time. But we can concentrate on the first part this time around. And the first part made literary history, to put it mildly, by introducing and having meet for the first time these two characters who will go on to be completely iconic on stage and screen and adaptations of every kind. And the story starts with John Watson, MD, recently invalided out of the British Army after serving in Afghanistan and being wounded there, who is now living on, a doctor's half pay. He's living as a civilian in London and is at odds with himself. Really has no idea what he wants to do with his life. The Victorians, of course, didn't know anything about post-traumatic stress disorder. So all that we hear about Watson, from Watson, he narrates the story, is that his nerves are shattered, that he can't even stand to go outside unless the weather is extremely clement. And he can't stand noise or racket of any kind. But he realizes after a very little time in the city that his money is not going to last forever and that he should find cheap accommodations. He should, in other words, room with someone. And he's at his old medical college and he meets one of his old colleagues there who says, I know someone here who is also looking to live with someone in inexpensive digs. And he goes to meet the person. The person is Sherlock Holmes, who right at the moment when Watson is introduced to him has developed an agent that will identify human blood in any kind of stain, differentiating it from all sorts of other tests that are time-consuming and ambiguous in their results. And Holmes is ecstatic about this, and it's interesting. You don't want to front read too much into this story. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote this thing 5 or 6 times. He shopped it around to everyone with a pulse. All of them turned it down. He got a pittance for it when it was finally bought. He wasn't thinking of eternity, to put it mildly. He wasn't thinking that he was introducing a major work into the canon. A volume like this, Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, with originally commissioned artwork, with a price tag of, what, $20, $25, designed to sell, would never have occurred to him that this would be happening 100 years later. But nevertheless, we don't want to front read too much into the story, but nevertheless, it's fascinating and I think indicative of the firmness with which Sherlock Holmes' character was fixed in Doyle's mind, that right away, in this first part of this first appearance, when Holmes is talking about his experiment, his new invention, the Sherlock Holmes test, he ironically calls it, the first thing he thinks about is not innocent people who have been convicted of wrong because a stain was considered to be blood when it wasn't. Rather, his first thought is for all the guilty people walking around who would long since have met their maker, who would long since have been executed if this test had existed. Sherlock Holmes the Avenger is very much present in that line. But anyway, he and Watson have a brief conversation in the 21st century, talking about living with a total stranger. To us, it seems incredibly brief. They basically run down their list of foibles, so that, as Holmes says, it's best that we be upfront with each other right away. Holmes is frank about his own foibles, that he can sometimes have long, torpid periods when he won't speak or even move, and that if you just ignore him, he'll be fine, and that he does experiments around the place, and that he scrapes on a violin from time to time. Holmes is being mild in his in his descriptions of his own eccentricities, but he gives Watson at least enough to go on. And Watson, in return, runs down his own deficiencies. He says, for instance, the enigmatic line, "I keep a bull pup." Victorian slang is notoriously bountiful. There have been many theories as to what that slang actually means. Does it mean I have a very bad temper when I'm aroused? Does it mean literally I have a bulldog puppy? No such dog is ever mentioned, and it's hard to imagine Mrs. Hudson, their landlady, putting up with one. Or does it mean, intriguingly, that he has a bastard son? Also never mentioned in the rest of the stories. We don't really know. Watson also mentions that his nerves are very delicate. He can't stand racket. He needs a roommate who's quiet and regular. They agree to live together. And they find rooms at 221B Baker Street. And it's furnished. They just have to move in with their stuff and set it out to best advantage, and they do. And because Watson has, no employment, he doesn't yet have a practice, he doesn't yet have friends in the city, he has very little to do other than observe his weird roommate. And he does. He observes Holmes in detail, and it even draws up a list of the limits and extents of Holmes's knowledge in all the different branches of knowledge. And he's fascinated to find that his new roommate is a weird combination of incredibly intelligent and incredibly unworldly, it seems to him at first. The most astonishing thing being that Holmes appears not to know the Copernican theory of the solar system. It appears not to know that the Earth revolves around the sun instead of vice versa. And when Watson, just too astonished to hold his mouth, actually says, but not knowing that the Earth revolves around the sun, Holmes upbraids him. It says, well, it doesn't make any difference to my line of work. I wouldn't care if the Earth revolved around the moon. It doesn't make any difference to me. Watson is very tempted to ask him what his line of work is, because at these early stages, in this very first part of this book, he doesn't know. And it's easily possible, especially as the stories go on, especially as Arthur Conan Doyle ripens the picture that he gives us of Holmes and Watson. It's easy to look back on this story and say that Holmes is just having a little fun at Watson's expense. And of course he knows all these things. He knows who Thomas Carlyle is. He knows about the Copernican theory, the Copernican view of the solar system. He knows these things. He's just trying to make a larger point, which is, I concentrate on my work. Because at this stage in the story, he's not famous yet. He says that he knows he can be famous. But although Scotland Yard, in the form of a rat-like Inspector Lestrade, will come to consult him on a regular basis, the world doesn't know him. And we're going to see that change in the course of the Sherlock Holmes canon. He does become world famous. To the point where not too much further along from here, he's known to the Queen. He's solving crimes on a European scale. People who come and lay their cases before him almost invariably in later stories, as a preamble to those cases, mention that he's extremely famous, that they know about him. But not in this first book. In this first book, he wants to be the world's first amateur consulting detective. And he gets a chance. He gets his big chance with a baffling crime, a grotesque dead body writing on the wall in blood that he has to figure out. And Watson goes along. Watson has nothing else to do. We're saved. The whole mechanism of this story really works because Watson is not a working stiff. He later on becomes a practicing physician in London. If he were in this story, he wouldn't be able to drop everything and follow Holmes at the drop of a hat, and we would miss out. As it is, he's able to follow Holmes to the scene of the crime and watch him in operation. And it's not anything that he expects. It's certainly nothing like the official police inspectors of Scotland Yard. Instead, it's a weirdly personal, almost magical relationship, one-on-one, between Holmes and the evidence. I'm not the first person to point out, but boy, reading this again, studying Scarlet again, I was really struck by the similarities between Sherlock Holmes and Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. I was really struck by those two, because they are intensely committed to their own arcane knowledge. They're not dedicated to to proving that knowledge. They're not dedicated to shouting it from the rooftops, but they're very much their own inner self-contained world in a way that is separate from the worlds of everyone around them. That might be pushing things a bit far, but one way or another, there's no denying the fact that what Holmes does with his methods of observation and intuition, as he calls it, looks like magic to everybody else. Now, as with all other magic, it's built on fraud, and I think those of you who are reading this for the first time, or maybe those of you who love Sherlock Holmes and are reading this for the 100th time, will notice that although Arthur Conan Doyle bases some of Sherlock Holmes' deductive feats on an old teacher of his who used to make a parlor game out of doing such things with his students, when Doyle was one of those students, this old teacher of his, Dr. Bell, would have someone stand up and say something, and after a minute or two, Bell would then reel off a whole bunch of things about that person that they did not themselves say. To the astonishment of the Lyceum crowd, he would reel off a whole bunch of details. You're not just you're left-handed, but you were right-handed growing up and forced to be left-handed. Your mother used to punish you with little drops of acid. Your father doesn't love you. Your father left home when you were 8. Stuff like that. Specifics that it seems he couldn't possibly know. Arthur Conan Doyle imports mental feats of prestidigitation like that into this story, and I am the first to admit they make great reading, but you can't look too closely at them. This is the key, is that you can't look too closely at them, any more than you can look too closely at those anecdotes of Dr. Bell that Doyle was happy to relate at drunken evenings at his club, because, as we know perfectly well from other first-hand accounts, Dr. Bell was wrong as often as he was right. It was the amazing few times that he was completely right and seemed to have no way of being right that his students remembered. But he often made extrapolations that were just extravagantly wrong. That's all. Same thing with Holmes. When Holmes tells Watson, I see you've been in Afghanistan, if you look at the actual list of inferences, of factors that went into his so-called intuition, you see that there are 10 different possible explanations for all of them. And that the one element doesn't shore up the others, as Holmes would have Watson believe that these things, one or the other, might be interpretable in many different ways, but put them together in a sequence and they telescope inward to only one possible conclusion. That's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. As is shown in a much later vague iteration of Sherlock Holmes, which was House MD, starring Hugh Laurie, a hit TV show in America from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in which Hugh Laurie plays the eponymous doctor, House, who does Sherlock Holmes feats of medical diagnosis. The rumor in the very first episode is that he once looked at someone and diagnosed heart disease. And the key element that I'm talking about here is that if you watch the House series, House is wrong 9 out of 10 times. His original guesses, his original intuitions, based on factors that he lays out, are wrong 9 out of 10 times. The only thing that Doyle's stroke of genius in this story and in later stories is that Holmes's intuitions are never wrong. You just have to learn to live with that if you're going to love these stories the way I do. But anyway, our read-along for today is that first half of Study in Scarlet, where Holmes and Watson meet each other, get called to the scene of a crime, and get involved in a case. The very first case starring Holmes and Watson as a team. And one of the things I wanted to point out, a couple of things that I want to point out about the first half of this incredibly famous little novel. And one of the things I want to point out is happenstance. People have often dissected A Study in Scarlet to try and figure out why this thing took off, why this became so incredibly popular. One of the most incredibly popular works of popular fiction ever written. And those of you who've never read A Study in Scarlet and you've just read this first part, this first half of our read-along, we're splitting the book in 2. So next week we'll read the second half of Study in Scarlet. Those of you who are reading Study in Scarlet for the first time, encountering all of this new, are going to read this first half and say, well, it's not hard to see why this would become so popular. There's nothing wrong. There's not a foot put out of place anywhere in this first half. Not only is it genius to have the reader like Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson is he's a sharp, opinionated, but normal person. And we meet him before we meet Sherlock Holmes. And when he meets Sherlock Holmes, he's meeting Sherlock Holmes for the first time. That is a most recurring character writers, most writers of recurring character stories don't have the foresight to do that. They don't give us the first meeting. When they do, it's perfect. The same thing happens in a couple of other very famous story sequences that I could name. But not all of them. Most of them don't do that. Most of them, the first meeting happens in a flashback. I maintain that that is one of the elements in kind of sort of tipping the scales in favor of whatever you're writing being a massive hit, is that you show readers the thing from the beginning and give them a grounding character that isn't the exceptional character. That's one of the things. And those of you reading this for the first time will say, well, okay, well, that worked perfectly. And also, the descriptions, the movement between scenes, it's all very lean. There's none of the elaborate atmosphere creating and scene setting that we mistakenly, I think, associate with Victorian literature. Instead, it's all very lean. We go from one spot to the next, and the descriptions, for instance, the place descriptions, pay attention next time you're reading to how Doyle describes places. Extremely evocative, almost cinematic, but with very few words, very few sentences. Not only all of that, but the crime itself, Doyle makes sure has two possible solutions right from the beginning, because it helps a lot to involve your readers if you're making them take sides. And that is our, I mean, there's just a couple of the many, there are many, very canny decisions going on in the first half of this book, character-wise, dialogue-wise, pacing-wise. But one way or another, we get to the end of this with a story completely embroiled. Our characters are completely embroiled in a story in which there is real danger. Another key element. This is not armchair detective. There's real danger, physical, imminent danger. As Holmes and Watson discover in many times in later stories, when you insert yourself into an ongoing crime in which people have violent ends and are willing to use violent means, that violence can envelop you. That's one of the thrills of Holmes and Watson, is that we're familiar with 221B Baker Street and the sitting room and the fog outside the window and the steps up to the consulting room. It all feels very domestic. It all feels very settled. But Holmes and Watson are in harm's way all the time. That's terrific fun. And that's where we're going to wrap things up for this week. And of course, I want to know what all of you are thinking of revisiting A Study in Scarlet, but I especially want to hear from people who have never read this before. There's no possibility. You may not have read this story before, but there's no possibility that you're not aware of Holmes and Watson. That's the power of this thing that he created, that Doyle created in this story. But nevertheless, you may be encountering them on the page like this for the first time, and I'm curious to know what you made of this first half. And those of you who've read Study in Scarlet a few times and love it, I hope, the way I do, I love it dearly. But those of you who've read it before are finishing this first half read-along same as I am, by cringing. Which seems weird. In a totally revered book like this, it seems weird to cringe, but nevertheless, we know what's coming, don't we? And newcomers to the story don't. What's coming is the second half of Study in Scarlet, which is one of the most bewildering literary decisions ever made by anyone. And I know I've said a couple of times here that this first half of The Study in Scarlet really holds up, and it does. There is no fat anywhere on the meat of this story. It's as amazing now, amazingly kinetic and involving now as it was 100 years ago. And none of that has ever been said about the second half of Study in Scarlet. And I want to prepare those of you who are going into this new. You are about to experience let's put it euphemistically, a change of pace for the second half. And what I want to stress, it must seem, those of you who haven't read this before, it must seem strange that I'm saying this, but nevertheless, I want to urge you, don't give up. Keep reading. when we'll meet again next Sunday, and we'll talk about the second half of Study in Scarlet. And I will do my best, as I have many times before, to justify the ways of Doyle to man and women. And I will do my best to help you through the second half of Study in Scarlet. So in the comments, feel free, as usual in these read-alongs, feel free to tell me everything. First impressions, second impressions, if you read the book and loved it a long time ago and then have revisited it now for the first time, tell me all about that. What things are jumping out at you that didn't jump out at you before, what you're appreciating now that you didn't before. Also, feel free, all of you, I think, I'm hoping that those of you who've been watching this channel for a while, there are 100 of you that are new, that have not been watching this channel for a while. So to you, I say welcome. Absolutely welcome. But those of you who've been watching for a while, I hope you will not suspect that I'm some sort of snobbish literary purist. I love TV and movie adaptations of literature with a passion. So in addition to telling me what you made of the story, feel free to tell me how it lines up with studies in Scarlet that you have seen on stage or on TV or in movies. I want to hear all of it. I want to hear everything about the first half of this novel, which is incredibly effective, before we take the cold bath plunge into the second half of this novel, which has never, to my knowledge, been called incredibly effective. So I'll wrap this up for now, and feel free. We'll talk about all this in the comments, and we'll reconvene next week for the second half of Study in Scarlet. And next week we will also, I will also let you know what we're doing for, we're not going to do 3 read-alongs for September. September has 5 Sundays, so we will, 5 weekends. So we will do a second book in September for the rest of September. So next Sunday we'll do the second half of Study in Scarlet, and then we'll do the rest of September with another book. And then we'll move on to October. I think I have winning choices for October and November, but one way or another. We'll convene next Sunday, and we'll talk about Doyle's interesting decisions with the second half of this book. And in the meantime, I will wrap it up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.